About a year or so ago, I was in contact with Mark about his book, Acid Communism, which I'd heard rumors about, didn't quite believe really existed, and finally succumbed to the temptation to ask him about it. Anyway, he sent me the introduction, which may have altered subsequently, and among the many striking observations, there was one section and one phrase that particularly struck me, partly because I was thinking along similar lines, and also because of what I was reading and listening to at the time. I wanted to ask Mark lots of questions about this project and this particular phrase he'd used, but it wasn't the right moment to start burdening him with my insights, so they went unasked. And so I am taking the opportunity to reconsider them now. Mark uses a passage from Danny Baker's autobiography to illustrate a moment that he then characterizes as expressing a sense of exorbitant sufficiency. I'll think about that phrase in two dimensions, political and aesthetic, because, as we are repeatedly told, there is only aesthetics in political economy. First, here's the passage from Baker's autobiography. It was July 1966, and I was newly 9 years old. We had holidayed on the Broads, and the family had recently taken possession of the gorgeous wooden cruiser that was to be our floating home for the next fortnight. It was called the Constellation, and as my brother and I breathlessly explored the twin beds and curtained portholes in our cabin built into the boat's bow, the prospect of what lay ahead saw the life force beaming from us like the rays of a cartoon sun. I made my way up through the boats to take up position in the small area out of the stern. On the way, I pick up Sister Sharon's teeny pink and white Sanyo transistor radio and switch it on. I look up at the clear blue afternoon sky. Ike and Tina Turner's River Deep, Mountain High was playing, and a sort of rapturous trance descended upon me. From the limitless blue sky, I looked down into the churning, crystal-peaked wake our boat was creating as we motored along. And at that moment, River Deep gave way to my absolute favorite song of the period, Bus Stop by the Hollies. As the mock flamenco guitar flourish that marks its beginning rose above the deep burble of the Constellation's engine, I stared into the tumbling waters and said aloud, but to myself, this is happening now. This is happening now. The preconditions for this experience of exorbitant sufficiency get spelled out in the text, essentially the high point of a post-war social democracy, and what Mark is keen to emphasize are the general preconditions of this particularly personal moment of rapture. In order to deflect the criticism that it only represents a nostalgic reflection on Baker's part or a typical Haussian moment from childhood. This is of a piece with many of Mark's observation that the foundations for a particular continuum of working-class art and music production, punk, post-punk, rave, drum and bass, were based on the possibilities of a dropping out and or going to art school, having a reasonably comfortable life on the dole, something that stops being possible around the mid to late 90s in the UK. Quote, "There is something very specific about this moment, something that means it could have only happened then. We can enumerate some of the factors that made it unique. A sense of existential and social security that allowed working-class families to take holidays at all. The role that new technology such as transistor radios played in both connecting groups to an outside and enabling them to luxuriate in the moment, a moment that was somehow exorbitantly sufficient." One of the ways in which hippie culture was anathema is in its focus on the child as symbol of nature and innocence, and Mark was a famous early advocate of antinatalist positions, championing No Future by Lee Edelman and so on. So I suppose my first question here would be, well, we have to be careful to make sure we are looking at the techno-economic paradigm that make these highly personal moments possible. Can childhood and the experience in childhood of the continuous levels of engagement and enlargement, the constant learning, the, if you like, repeated epiphanies, be a good model for acid communist or exorbitantly sufficient subjectivities? I am also thinking here a little bit of a recent proposal for a national education service in the UK, a non-neoliberal equivalent to the market demand for lifelong learning, because there is something psychedelic in the world-renewing properties of theorizing and reconceptualizing, and that's consonant in some ways with Mark's interest in the notion of an outside, this space beyond current conceptions and boundaries that we can constantly push into. Can we locate a radical version of the inner child? Can we repurpose it? Move it away from the kind of wide-eyed avatar of some essential goodness and wonder into a questing and adventurous, intellectually omnivorous, polymorphous subject, one that retains openness to an outside and that doesn't ossify into a realist adult or highly individualized subjectivity. There are several categories that Mark identifies as being essential to this sense of exorbitant sufficiency. Light and space are two of them, but the most essential is perhaps time, free or unpressured time. And the sense of unpressured time comes, of course, from being a child, but also from a lack of anxiety about the future. Exorbitant sufficiency has an ambiguous relationship toward the future as the space into which we project both anxiety and hope. Both of those projections can occur if the present is intolerable, fallen, and will be redeemed in some way by the yet to come. You might want to say that in exorbitantly sufficient moments, the experience is one of time being in joint, as opposed to being out of joint. I'll tentatively suggest that perhaps the time is always out of joint, but that there are positive and negative modalities of that disjointedness. And I'd also suggest that there's something slightly bittersweet in Baker's passage, which is perhaps why Mark says that it could have only happened then, as it takes place just as a shift of a certain kind is occurring, and that shift is symbolized here by the transistor radio that Baker takes up onto the bow of the boat. One of Mark's most influential formulations or projects was Hauntology. Hauntology expressed a time out of jointedness in its negative mode. A certain future should have appeared, a better present should exist, but has failed to come into being, and the remnants of this better present are scattered around us, provoking us, reminding us of the lost possibilities. This idea is given a certain kind of empirical base by economists like Carlota Perez, who is essentially a long-wave theorist of capitalism, and who argues that a shift toward a different type of post-Fordism, a production regime not based on oil, mass production, and disposability, should have occurred around the 1970s, but the spatial fix, essentially the opening up of China and the economic power of big oil to suppress alternate technologies, among other factors, have kept us trapped in an unnaturally elongated, slowly and unevenly differentiating Fordist moment. Interestingly enough, the subject that Perez imagines as the new consumer of this deferred future present is very similar to the figure of the hipster. She believes that elites lead the way culturally, so these would be moneyed connoisseurs interested in specialized, high-quality, durable goods, interested in recycling and reclaiming, and oriented toward vintage and low-energy-intensive forms of commodity accumulation, creativity, upcycling, if you like. So, to a degree, the 2000s in which Mark formulated his hauntology was haunted both by the remnants of the utopian promise of an early order, modernism, intersecting these kinds of harbingers of a Perezian future, temporally stranded and wandering around Dalston waiting for solar panels and vertical farming to arrive. Time can also be out of joint in a good way, however, and I'd think here about Mark's complaint that with regard to modern technology's role in music, you can't hear it anymore, using the example of Brian Eno's synths and tapes and the way they erupted into Roxy Music's often quite standard pastiche pop and rock tunes, inducing in the listener an exhilarating frisson of future shock. Here the time is out of joint because the future is forcing its way back into the present, opening a passage in space-time and allowing the ghost of the yet to come, more an angel than a ghost perhaps, to come floating in. In the passage with the young Danny Baker on the boat, we have a couple of key interrelations. Firstly, the surrounding countryside offering an image of the eternal, the pastoral, and the sublime, the boat and its engine, an older classical form, an established type of technology, and the emergent future, as symbolized by the radio. As it notes, though, the radio is tiny and portable, and the moment therefore captures something of an inflection point in terms of the possibilities of future shock as an affect or an experience, and it's a notion which disappears from the culture, probably from the late 70s onward, and is, to some extent, an addiction that people of a certain generation have never been able to wean themselves off. Indeed, you might want to argue that a lot of the accelerationist project, both aesthetically and politically, is redolent of future shock envy on the part of a younger generation. For this future shock to occur, I think the technology has to be visible in the same way as it has to be hearable in music. Hence, in a kind of vulgarized, or at least popularized hauntology, and in steampunk we have a fetishization of clunky, monolithic early versions of technology with huge, glowing cathode tubes, gramophones, vast banks of synths, and so on. So as technology miniaturizes, blends in with its surroundings, becomes invisible, becomes more of a discrete frame, as architecture does too around this point, then this kind of a juxtaposition, the eternal, the residual, the emergent, begins to disappear. Even though cyberpunk, extropian, and to some extent accelerationist, fantasies focus on seamless integration, technical augmentation, the man-machine, and so on. In a way, a certain affect, a certain dramatic temporal tension is lost with miniaturization. The future side of the relationship falls away, becomes invisible, and the present feels lopsided, dislocated, out of joint. So, I suppose another question I would have there is, what's the relationship of exorbitant sufficiency to time? Is it only possible at a given historical moment? A good out-of-jointedness? Is this why it can't seem to come again? The term exorbitant sufficiency expresses that one has enough, yet that enough feels luxurious, far in excess of what's required. So this is a paradox, or an oxymoron. And this sense of completeness in the moment, this lack of orientation to the future, puts me in mind of Todd McGowan's recent work. McGowan's a Lacanian, which makes reading him a rather forbidding prospect, at least it does for me. But essentially, McGowan tries to build a politics, an anti-capitalist politics, of the death drive. To very crudely summarize his argument, we have suffered an originary loss, and we try to replace this loss all through our lives by pursuing an object that will stand in for the loss, which promise a sense of completeness but only lead us to experience disappointment, because what we actually want is the disappointment itself, the loss that allows us to continue desiring. The chase is better than the catch, as Motorhead put it. McGowan believes all orientation toward the future is inherently bound up in capitalist desire, that the constant search for and repetition of failure maps onto the structure of capital accumulation. Orientation toward the future as a salvationary space is caught up in the logic of profit motive, commodity production, etc. All of this is expressed through the kind of counterintuitive and paradoxical formulations of which Mark was fond, the title of his book being Enjoying What We Don't Have. What we should stop doing for McGowan is precisely thinking about the future, seeking out boundaries and limits to overcome in the belief that beyond them there is a true satisfaction, possible as we already have everything we need, or possibly everything we don't need, or, perhaps better still, we already don't have everything we don't need. There are problems with McGowan's work in that it fails to address the body and material needs, poverty, and so on. It's hard not to be oriented toward the future and accumulation if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, or you face crop failure this summer. And so there is an extent to which McGowan is really perhaps addressing in a more rarefied register the affluenza that bedevils his students and his peers. Either way, this refusal of the future overlaps in some ways with Mark's exorbitant sufficiency. The moment burgeons into a sense of plenitude because in some ways it's been bracketed off. The relationship with acid here might be fairly clear. Acid shuts down the memory and the sense of anticipation. The music critic Simon Reynolds likened its results to one being dazzled by the moment. So the next question I would have asked is whether a post-capitalist desire is at odds with a demand for the future, and whether an exorbitantly sufficient renunciation of the future isn't also an option to be considered. Does the idea of exorbitant sufficiency map in some ways onto the communal luxury more than luxury communism? Thinking about exorbitant sufficiency as an aesthetic, one of the songs Mark mentions as exemplifying this is The Kinks, Lazing on a Sunny Afternoon. Free time, a certain luxuriousness of surroundings, life devoted to the lucid, but also, crucially, a loss or a sense of being unencumbered. I am going to suggest a series of qualities that I think are required for a work to add it to a canon of exorbitantly sufficient, and do that on the basis of some of my interpretation of the phrase I have already outlined. I think it should contain a sense of the good childlike, in the sense that it must have a certain numinous quality, a sense not of breaking into new territory, overcoming boundaries, but of transformation or enlargement. It should concentrate on a concentrated moment, and that moment should be paradoxically illuminated by the eclipse of the future. Should have a sense of ease and lassitude. Should formally express a relation and tensions between deep time and the traditional and the defamiliarizing possibilities of the technological, but without aiming at the sense of the ruptural that characterized future shock. It should have something of the reverie and the epiphany. I am going to nominate a song for this, and that's Estuary Bed by the Triffids, from an album with an interesting title, Born Sandy Devotional. The song title is also relevant. Estuaries are as much a combination of forces pulling in different directions as they are a confluence, an arresting of motion, and a deepening of it. Rich, teeming environments alive with growth, ancient and yet also densely populated, worked over by humans, in some ways undermined by them. Here it is.
The children are walking back from the beach. Sun on the sidewalk is burning their feet. They're washing the salt off in the shower, wasting away the hours and hours and hours. Come over your father's back fence. For the very last time, we'll take a shortcut across his lawn. They lie together on the estuary bed, perfectly still, perfectly warm. Sleep no more. Sleep is here. Sleep no more. Estuary bed, estuary bed.
There is an emphasis on childhood, unhurried time, sunlight, nature, a sense of rebirth. sloughing an old skin, awakening, mutual embrace, mutual transformation. The track itself is essentially a pretty straight folk rock track, given a particular brightness and ambient edge through the production. As it progresses, the lead vocal becomes increasingly detached from the background, swimming into a kind of overlapping, multi-tracked, oneiric drift, urging whoever the song addressee is, perhaps the singer themselves, to awake, to face life replenished. There is nothing but two people lying together in the sun, in a particular favorite place, and yet the song implies this is everything, more than anything one could want, exorbitantly sufficient. So, I suppose all of this just has to be a long preamble to the question, what do you think of this song, Mark? Do you like it? To which his answer would have almost certainly have been, no.